For Good Friday, I want to share with you a text as a reflection as we wait and meditate and come to the cross. A text from Rowan Williams, who writes about the silence of the Christ. One of the most dramatic of these moments is Jesus' silence before his judges, before the high priest and the governor. The gospel narratives show us how the high priest or Pontius Pilate urged Jesus to speak. "Why don't you answer me?" says Pilate. "Don't you know that I have the power to crucify you or release you?" And we're told in St. John's Gospel that when Jesus gives no answer to the charges made against him, Pilate wonders, he is amazed. Now, the odd thing in these stories is that Jesus is precisely in the position of someone having his voice taken away. He is a person who has been reduced to silence by the violence and injustice of the world around him. But then, mysteriously, he turns this around. His silence, his complete presence and openness, his refusal to impose his will in a struggle, becomes a threat to those who have power, or think they have power. "For God's sake, talk to me," says the high priest, more or less. "I adjure you in the name of the living God, tell us." And Pilate's wonderment, bafflement, and fear in the face of Jesus' silence are a reminder that in this case, Jesus, as it were, takes the powerlessness that has been forced on him and turns it around so that his silence becomes a place in the world where the mystery of God is present. In a small way, that's what happens when we seek to be truly and fully silent, or let ourselves be silenced by the mystery of God. We become a place where the mystery of God happens. The sight of somebody praying or meditating in silence is itself something that reduces us to silence. If you go into a Buddhist meditation hall or a convent chapel and you see somebody deep in meditation, you don't, on the whole, if you've got any sense, try to start a conversation, because the very fact that silence is happening tells us that there is something there that we're not going to cope with, something out of the normal, out of our normal repertoire of resources. And so Jesus' supreme, eloquent silence before his judges is in a sense the moment of supreme revelation in the Gospels. It is where he becomes visibly the mysterious reality that nobody knows how to talk about. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" asks the high priest. And Jesus says, "If you want." "Are you the King of the Jews?" asked Pilate. And Jesus says, "As you say." And this terrible refusal to answer the question tells both Caiaphas and Pilate that what is happening in Jesus is something immeasurably out of the ordinary categories and habits by which people organize the world. That's why the strange thing about these stories is that they become themselves a moment of revelation, a moment of epiphany. In all our theology and all our reflection on the person of Jesus, all the enormously complex and careful and sophisticated ways of talking we've evolved over the centuries about Jesus, rightly and correctly and inevitably, it's essential that we should let them lead us back to that moment of Jesus before his judges, that moment when nobody knew what to call him because there were no words for God made human. What faced Caiaphas and Pilate was something so much out of any imaginable intellectual world that there was nothing to be said. Let's pause for just a moment to consider this question of how we, in our attempts to be silent, become silencing realities, the nun in the convent chapel, or the meditator in the meditation hall, who bring us to silence. We have to be, to some extent, in our small way, like Jesus before the judges. We have to be the place where the question of God, the mystery of God, comes alive. It's not that we're doing and saying such devastatingly interesting things that we're blazing with holiness and mysteriousness in our ordinary lives. It would be very nice, but it doesn't happen a lot. Rather, we will transmit something just by letting God be in us and showing as best we can that we're struggling to let God be by holding back, recognizing that we are powerless to express, let alone to manage the mystery. I was struck recently while reading Julian of Norwich again by how much at the very heart of her vision there is the sense that all you've got to do in prayer is let God be God. Remembering that Christ says to her, I am the ground of thy beseeching, I am your prayer. That is, the mystery that's going on when we try to pause, stop, be still, be in silence, let God occur. So often we try to convey or communicate the character and work of God to others by stepping up the noise and activity. And yet for God to communicate who and what God is, God needs our silence.